But before we get started, we had a question at the round table about the biblical canon this last Sunday afternoon. If you guys don't come to our round table, I think everybody here was a part of that. And so I wanted to take a brief moment to address that because we had the question come up, why are Catholic and Protestant Bibles different? You know, there's more books in the Catholic Bible than there are in Protestant Bibles. And we discussed a little bit about that. We discussed how the New Testament canon was received and how it was recognized by the early church and the development of the New Testament canon, but that didn't really answer the question because in the New Testament, Catholic and Protestant Bibles are really the same. The difference is in the Old Testament. So I wanted to take just a moment to answer that question since that was raised. You'll need to know a little bit of history before we get too far. At the time, of course, that the original apostles, the early church, they were writing the New Testament. But at the time they were there, the primary Bible that was used by all Hebrews was the Septuagint, called the Septuagint. And it's a Greek translation of the Old Testament. Jesus and the other apostles quote the Septuagint extensively. In fact, most of the quotations you see in the New Testament from the Old are from the Greek Septuagint, which is the reason why sometimes it doesn't quite match up with what you see in the Old Testament if you try to do the cross references. As the church grew, well, they naturally used that version of the Old Testament as their Bible because, you know, the New Testament was still being written by Paul and the other apostles, and they were using the Septuagint. And the Septuagint, though, it includes books that are in the Catholic Bibles, but not in the Protestant Bibles. Those books were not included in the Hebrew translations of the Old Testament, which was known as the Tanakh. Not included in the Hebrew versions. But when they made the Septuagint, they made it into the Septuagint based on historical value, not really doctrinal value, but historical value. And so it was included in the Septuagint, but not in the Tanakh. Okay, does that make sense? And so as the Bible started being translated, even some of the early church fathers questioned the value of retaining those books. Most famously, one of the fathers of the church, Jerome, really in the 5th century, he translated the entire Bible into Latin, giving some of you may be familiar with what's known as the Latin Vulgate. That became really the standard text for about 1,000 years or so. But Jerome didn't want to originally translate those questionable books, what we know as the Apocrypha. Eventually, he submitted to the requests of the Catholic Church. Augustine and other people, they did value those books, and there was a little debate back and forth between them, but they never really had the same validity as the rest of the books in the Bible. Well, eventually the Reformation comes, right? And Protestant reformers begin translating the Bible back from their original languages into the common language. And so you have people like Luther translating it into German and Wycliffe translating it into English and so on and so forth. But they were going back to the original Greek and the original Hebrew manuscripts that they had at the time. And so they intended not to include, the books known as the Apocrypha because they were not included in the Hebrew version of those manuscripts. Does that make sense? And so some Protestant Bibles, including the original King James, did include them, but they always kept them apart from the rest of the Scripture. Eventually the Apocrypha was just set aside. Now, technically, Catholics today still view those books on the same level as the rest of Scripture, but at the same time, they label them as deuterocanonical. So a second canon, second level, basically. They weren't even officially recognized as part of Catholic Scripture until the Council of Trent, which we discussed in 1546. And that was only done as a response to what the Protestant reformers were doing, because the reformers were taking them out. They said, no, we want to reaffirm these books. And it was just done as a response. And so there are really many reasons not to accept the Apocrypha and Deuterocanon or whatever as the same level as inspired Scripture because, one, again, it wasn't included in the original Old Testament that was received and used by the Jews. Not at all. Second, neither Jesus nor any of the New Testament writers quote them at all. That's a pretty good reason. Third, some of the books have documented historical errors, such as labeling Nebuchadnezzar the king of Assyria rather than Babylon. And fourth, some of the books have doctrinal incompatibilities with the rest of Scripture, such as purgatory or teaching justification by works. And you can get a whole list of other things at various websites. carm.org has some good stuff, CARM. But obviously the authentic Bible is inerrant and infallible. It wouldn't have those kind of errors. It doesn't contain errors. It doesn't lead us astray in any teaching. And so we have then in our Protestant Bibles the 66 books of the New Testament, but those were the books originally recognized by the Jews in their Hebrew Tanakh, also recognized, of course, by the New Testament church and the New Testament. So you've got God's believers attesting to this both prior to Jesus' birth and after his ascension. Does that make sense now? Does that say where it came from? Okay, I did want to answer that since we had a good discussion along that line. That's a lot to say up front. That really has nothing to do with what we're talking about tonight. But I did want to answer that question because I didn't want to leave it unanswered from the other day.